oligarchies remain powerful only to the extent that we privatize our dreams and we privatize our fears. And we get paralyzed by them, and we get stuck on the couch, feeling that nothing is within our control. If we stand any chance of collective and personal emancipation, liberation, in the end, joy, fun, genuine happiness, that can only come to us the moment we say, no, I'm not going to sit here idly by, lamenting my powerlessness. I'm going to go out there and try to change the world. I will fail, in the same way that I know that one day I'll die. Doesn't stop me from trying to live every day to the full. Collective action, collective dreams are a prerequisite for individual freedom.
Greece.
The debt crisis in Greece sparking violent protests, helping to trigger the rapid sell-off as investors worry that Europe's debt problems will
Good
spread.
stuff, this. Just listen to it. It's good. You should know a lot of it already, but
and of course the
it's
darkest
well
fear
condensed.
is they drag down the U.S. economy, really the U.S. recovery.
Syriza has grown from a motley alliance of activists to become the official opposition. And though the groups on this demo look like activists everywhere, here their party currently leads in the opinion polls.
Okay, how my parents met.
Yeah, how your parents met.
Yeah.
Fuck.
Okay. Start. I grew up in a fascist country. My father was apprehended for being a student leader, and the police that apprehended him apologized for having done so, but then gave him a denunciation of communism form to sign, and my father, being liberal, said, well, I'm not a communist, I'm not a Buddhist, I'm not a Muslim, but if you ask me, as an organ of the state, sir, to sign this kind of denunciation of Islam or of Buddhism or of communism, I'm not going to do it because it's none of your business. He refused to sign it, and then he was beaten up very badly. And he was tortured for months and months and months in ways that I don't even want to discuss on camera. The more they tortured him, the more they beat him up, the more stubbornly he was refusing to sign that piece of paper. He said to me that the worst
I have a
moment
criticism of this documentary,
in the camp
but alright, that makes more
was
people
the
enjoy it.
moment when he realized
It's the kind of
that if his side
sad
had
piano
won the civil war,
that my dad
communists,
was tortured
he would be
piano
in the same
music.
concentration
need for
camp
it.
with different guards.
But it is good.
And I asked him, what did he mean by that? He said, well, there came a moment when
I've
he
learned
received,
nothing new,
in secret, of course,
but, you know,
a directive from the Communist Party to sign it, so as to get out. And my father refused.
That's interesting shit, it is.
Refused the instructions of the Communist Party. And then he was denounced by the Communist Party for not
and by the way, don't think he's this bit. He's not going,
so he ended up in the
both
concentration
bad.
camp,
He's not doing
shunned by his comrades and tortured by the fascists.
Right, here we are.
He realized then that authoritarianism runs deeply on both sides. That was a warning to me as a left-winger. When my father came out of the camp, out of exile, after four and a half years, this was in the early 1950s, to go back to Athens University, he was a shadow of a man, determined to just concentrate on his studies as a means of surviving. In the university, he came across a young woman, actually the first female student of chemistry in the history of the University of Athens. And she was approached, because of her antipathy towards communists, by a quasi-fascist, well, actually quasi-Nazi organization, who recruited her and gave her a task to keep tabs on my dad.
I wasn't concentrating, I was listening to bloody Yanis.
So this is how they met. And of course, after a few weeks, she dropped out of that horrible organization, and they were together. Their paths converged politically.
Well played,
but I remember
Yanis'
that
dad.
when, on the very few occasions, because they always had a very loving relationship, but when they would fight, the old rapture re-emerged. And I remember once hearing her call him a bloody communist, and him calling her a bloody fascist. I think that deep down, my father was always motivated to ensure that his fate would not be repeated in my case. In 1975, I was 14. It was a year after the dictatorship had collapsed. And I remember I was distributing leaflets for some kind of demonstration in the evening. This copper approached me from behind and grabbed me, and before I knew it, I was in a cell. And of course, my parents were climbing various walls, besides themselves with worry. So I arrived at home at around 6:30, exhausted. There were no charges, there was nothing, there was just intimidation. That night, my father sat me down with my mom, and they both said to me, right, you're going to study in the United Kingdom. I don't care what you study, anything from anthropology to zoology, but you are out of here. So I decided I was going to be a theoretical physicist. There was a Greek politician at the time who was leading the political party that I belonged to as a teenager. And he was going to give me a reference letter because he had been an academic in the Anglo-Saxon world. So he sat me down. He didn't know who I was. He just knew that I was an activist in the party. And he asked me what I wanted to study, and I said, to remind him. And I said, theoretical physics, I'm going to study in Britain. He said, no, you won't. What? What audacity? I said, so what am I going to study? He said, you'll do mathematical economics. Mathematical economics? I was raging. Yeah, I was so annoyed with him that he would have the goal to have a view as to what I was going to study, given that he had precisely zero information about me, except for the fact that I was a political activist. But then he explained it, made perfect sense. He said, listen, theoretical physics and mathematical economics are exactly the same from a mathematical perspective. It's the same mathematics, the same models. The difference, he said, is this. If you study theoretical physics, nobody's going to take your political view seriously. If you study mathematical economics, because of the power of the narrative, everybody will be paying attention. Suddenly you will have a capacity to influence people. My life was finished. I became an economist. Up until the early 2000s, I was perfectly contented being an academic holed up in my office in whichever university I happened to be at. But at around 2002, 2003, I experienced a certain sense of anxiety at the sight of financialization's impending crisis. I could feel that I was living in a world that was about to blow up. I was beginning to sound the alarm whenever I could, even in the context of discussions with politicians, trying to warn them that the tsunami was coming. And we cannot stop it, but we have to prepare for it.
Meltdown on the markets as Wall Street is left reeling from some of the biggest blows in its history.
Fucking Fiona
Stock
Bruce.
markets have fallen here and around the world as one of America's oldest and biggest banks files for bankruptcy.
Debt is to capitalism that which hell is to Christianity. Unpleasant and essential. Whereas debt was tangential to life before capitalism. With capitalism, it becomes the turbocharging unit of production. It's what allowed immense productive resources and capacities and forces to be unleashed by capitalism, the result being the modern world that we live in. The problem with that is that if you're going to move to an industrial scale of capitalist production with networked firms, with the large conglomerates of that Henry Ford, Thomas Edison and the rest built, and now the Googles and the Facebooks and so on, you need enormous banks. Enormous banks means enormous amount of power by the bankers to push their hand through the time-space continuum, reach out into the future and take value that has not been created yet from the future, bring it to the present, and lend it to various entrepreneurs to produce the value so that the loop of recycling between debt and wealth is completed. But the more successful the financiers are in doing this, the greater their urge to keep taking more value from the future and bringing it into the present in the form of debt. At some point, the present can no longer service its debt servicing needs towards the future. And that is when you have a crisis. The 2008 crisis was not one of the normal periodic downturns. It is the longest, most slow-burning, damage-inducing crisis in the history of capitalism. The implosion of the pyramid of financial capital.
Fucking hell. Shit.
President Obama and I are agreed that
Oh,
the
look,
world
it's
is coming
Gordon
together
Brown.
to act in the face of
You're
unprecedented global
joking.
financial times.
Good man, Gordon Brown. Better than most of them.
In 2009, something remarkable happened. The Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, received a telephone call from her treasury telling her that the German banks were bankrupt. At the very same time, the French banks were going bankrupt. She had to save the German banks to the tune of 550 billion euros, all in one go. This, to her, was political poison. At least, she felt, I've done it, now can move on. No. A few months later, she was told that she has to give another 300 or 400 billion to the French and German banks because of the money they had lent to Greece, and Greece was about to default on its debt to Deutsche Bank, Finanzbank, Société Générale, BNP Paribas. And she said, I can't do this. I cannot go back to my federal parliament to ask for another wad of money for the same banks. It will be my political end. So what does she do instead? She goes to the federal parliament
Shit.
seeking 110 billion
she goes,
initially, another
Merkel.
130 later, as solidarity to the Greeks.
Maybe
On the
I should
basis that
listen to him before I destroy
the
him.
grasshoppers of the south, they are now bankrupt. Solidarity in Europe means we have to help them. We don't want to help them, but we must, because this is what it takes to keep Europe together. So a second bailout loan for the same German and French banks was portrayed as solidarity with the Greeks. What the German parliamentarians and the German public were never told was that almost none of that money went to Greece. It went to the French and German banks, mostly. It became a matter of honor and political expediency and political power reproduction to prevent the public and parliamentarians across Europe ever from finding out that this was a hidden bailout for the French and German banks. So it was always the Greeks this, the Greek that, the Greeks must repay their debt, and denial that it was all a kind of bankruptcy concealment. Denial that that debt was never going to be repaid. The rules of the Eurozone banned any bailout, so they had to find ways of violating their own rules. The European Commission, which was supposedly the government of the European Union, had no credibility with a hard-nosed German finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, or with the German central bank, the Bundesbank. Who did? The International Monetary Fund, who had decades of experience of applied misanthropy in Africa, in Asia, in all sorts of different societies that it plundered on behalf of creditors. This troika of the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund became the shadow government of Europe, and its first task was to impose the bailouts, which is a combination of socialism for the bankers with austerity for the many.
This country is engulfed in a crisis, and for the past 48 hours has been tearing itself apart. On the streets here of Syntagma Square, a battle has been fought and lost by protesters, but the evidence on the ground here of political resistance means it will be very difficult for the Prime Minister George Papandreou and his government to push through the package of austerity measures that they say this country so desperately needs.
Thieves, thieves, they shout at their government, as inside the Greek parliament they debate a motion of no confidence. There is certainly no confidence outside, just fury at those who have brought such hardship on their country. In this crowd, at least, there is consensus. They can never repay the debt, and nor should they.
The problem is that in the Greek parliament here, there is not a single major political party
It'll never happen in your country, in our country. It's just those Greeks.
And that Greece should default on its
They're
debt.
just lazy.
The onus was upon me to come up with proposals. And I began to write articles and appear on BBC television and left, right, and center, talking about the European crisis that was coming, with Greece being the subprime nexus of Europe. Due to the fact that it was common knowledge that I had been close at some point to the person who had become prime minister in Greece, the prognostication for me that the Greek state is bankrupt, that became big news. And I immediately became the pole of attraction of the oligarchy's intense hatred. I was accused of being a national traitor, because only a national traitor can precipitate and bring forward a bankruptcy by declaring the Greek state to be bankrupt. And of course, I was not the banker's best mate. I knew that there would be repercussions. One night, it was a Saturday night in 2011, my wife's son arrived home after having been out with friends very late. We hear the thud, we hear his footsteps going towards his bedroom. So we both surrendered to sleep. A few minutes later, the landline rings. Pick up the phone, and there is this suave male voice saying, "Mr. Varoufakis, we're very pleased, we, the royal we, we're very pleased that your son has come back from a good night out with friends." "Who are you? Who is this?" He carried on, describing where the nice son had been, naming streets. He finished by saying, "If you want him to continue to return safely every night, you better lay off. And he mentioned a particular bank. The next morning I told my wife what had happened, and she said to me, listen, either you get into politics to protect us, or we get out of the country. So we got out of the country. We migrated to Austin, Texas, of all places.
Outside the headquarters of the conservative New Democracy Party tonight, the cheers of supporters who have won a narrow and uncertain victory, but a victory for all that. Their leader, Antonis Samaras, is the man most likely to be the country's next prime minister, but it's still far from certain he'll have the votes in parliament to govern with any effect.
Will you be able to form a government now?
We'll have to, and very soon.
I will make sure that the sacrifices of the Greek people will bring the country back to prosperity.
By 2014, Greece had already undergone 4 or 5 years of a Great Depression. We had lost 28% of national income. 1.3 million unemployed in a country of 10 million people, of whom only 9% ever received a single penny in unemployment benefits. 400,000 young men and women, the best qualified, had left the country. So effectively, we're talking about a failed state. When pensions began to decline, and older people increasingly felt that they were a burden on their families, we had a spate of tragic, heart-wrenching suicides. A man in northern Greece went to the Social Security Department's offices to inquire as to why his tiny little pension had been eliminated. They told him that these are the rules and regulations under the Troika and there's nothing they can do. He thanked them, and bystanders, witnesses, tell us that he looked dazed. And he walked out, disappeared. His body was found about 2 weeks later in a nearby woods. He had hanged himself. The only message he left was to his wife, look after the kids.
It's a little bit like Greece was the subprime borrower, such as we know here in the U.S., and the banks over in Europe are getting nervous that subprime borrower, Greece, is essentially going to walk away from the mortgage that they owe the bank. And so that's essentially the root of the problem.
Sandwich!
How would you respond to someone who said that Greece had a moral obligation to pay back its debts?
Debtors have traditionally been presented as sinners. The problem with biblical economics, with moralism applied to debt, is firstly that it's from an ethical point of view very dubious. But I find it more interesting to criticize it as absolutely inimical to the notion of capitalism. Capitalism took off only when the bourgeoisie accepted that every debt is not sacred. It was only the institution of the public limited company that allowed capitalism to take off. So the workhouse, the debtor's prison, had to be closed down before capitalism succeeded.
Too, Yanis.
And the reason is really very simple. If a debt that cannot be repaid confines one to prison forever, then clearly nobody's going to take any substantial risk. The risks that capitalism requires in order to keep progressing, leaping boundlessly as it has been over the last 200 years. Suppose we as a society were to guarantee bankers, that which we have guaranteed at least since 2008, but setting that aside, suppose we were to guarantee all bankers that every single loan that they gave out would be somehow repaid. Somehow repaid. God, by society, bailouts. Suddenly the bankers never have to worry that they will lose money, that some of their loans will not be repaid. If you were a banker with such a cast iron guarantee that all your loans will be repaid with interest, suddenly you have absolutely no incentive to be careful as to whom you lend money to. But that means that a gigantic debt bubble would be created, which would inevitably burst, and therefore the guarantee would not be honored and the banking system would collapse. So, unsustainable debt, debt haircuts, debt write-offs are an essential aspect of capitalism. Moreover, to say that the ethical burden falls squarely and exclusively with the debtors is to lose sight of the very simple fact that for every irresponsible debtor, there is an irresponsible lender. Economic and psychological depression was in the air. In reality, but in propaganda, it was being presented as a success story. The whole purpose of the propaganda was to win the elections that were coming up in order to maintain the fallacy and the illusion that Greece had been stabilized. It had been stabilized in the same way that a comatose patient is stable, in the same way that death is equivalent to stability. That was the state of Greece in 2014. And suddenly, somebody who is about to inherit the mantle of the prime ministership of the most bankrupt nation in Europe, Alexis Tsipras, the young new leader of the coalition of the radical left, says to you, your proposals are the right ones and they need to be implemented. But we need you to play an active part in doing it. At that moment I thought, oops, what does one do?
Το δίλημμα απέναντι στον ελληνικό λαό είναι καθαρό. Το δίλημμα είναι μνημόνιο ή ΣΥΡΙΖΑ. Το δίλημμα είναι υποταγή ή αποφασιστική σκληρή διαπραγμάτευση. Το δίλημμα είναι λιτότητα ή ανάπτυξη.
When this party was rising up in the polls, it was managing to inspire hope in the hearts of the many. Its leader and leadership were coming closer and closer to proposals I believed were the right proposals, getting us out of debtor's prison. So let's say that Syriza gets elected tomorrow. What do? Do you get out of the Eurozone? Do you say, I'm going to simply create my own currency, see it diminish in value by 95%, and try to go for autarky? There is a case for this. There is a case for this. Argentina more or less did that. And I support what they did entirely. But Argentina had two major advantages that Greece and Portugal and Ireland don't have. The first one was that it had its own currency. The peso existed. It was only a matter of cutting the peg with the US dollar and then defaulting and allowing the peso to fall. The second thing it had was huge tracts of land producing the goods that China wanted to buy precisely at that moment. Greece doesn't have either of these. We don't have the drachma to devalue. We have to create a currency. It will take, in my estimation, at least 8 months to create it. So it's like, this is a bit like announcing 8 months in advance devaluation. Do you know what this means? There will be nothing left 8 months from now after the new currency is created. So, if I'm right in that, and not everybody agrees with me on the left, but if I'm right in that, the only alternative is negotiations.
Our common future in Europe is not the future of austerity. It's the future of democracy, solidarity and cooperation.
I felt that it was almost impossible for me to resist getting involved with them. But I have to admit that when the offer was made, I panicked. Can I trust Syriza? Can I trust the leadership? Because I knew that our election would signal, it would trigger a war with the creditors. The creditors were hell-bent on maintaining the status quo, maintaining the debtor's prison, that is Greece, maintaining the unsustainable debt, because unsustainable debt is power for the creditors. They would have the media on their side, they would have the banks on their side, the European Central Bank on their side, the International Monetary Fund, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the BBC. You know, the whole cabal would be there doing battle against us to keep our people in debtor's prison. So I knew that we would have a massive battle in our hands. And unity was of the essence. Now, like David and Goliath, you may win if you're David. You have a little catapult, maybe it will work. As the finance minister who would have to go to the Eurogroup to fight for our side, I would have that little catapult, which comprised a number of little weapons that we had. But for that catapult to be used, I would have to have the complete backing of our team. Prime Minister and the War Cabinet, as we used to call it. The great question that was exercising in my mind was, would I have their backing? Not at the beginning, not at the middle, but to the very end. Would they stick around? Would unity prevail until that last second? That was the great question. There was a very good reason why it was inside my head, preventing me from sleeping at night. This reluctance to join was overcome by writing my letter of resignation and carrying it in the inside pocket of my jacket wherever I went, as a reminder of the fact that this is not for me. This is a chore. This is like taking the rubbish out at night. Somebody has to do it. You're doing it. Don't get wedded to it. Now, imagine a friend of yours comes to you and his income from his business has shrunk by 50%, and he can't pay his mortgage. He's about to lose his house. And then he says to you, but I have a solution. There is this bank that offers me a credit card to meet my mortgage repayments. What do you think? Is this a good idea? If you are a friend, you've got to say to them, don't do it. Do not take a credit card out to pretend that you are repaying your mortgage. Now imagine that your friend said to you that the bank would only give him this credit card on condition that he agrees to shrink his income further. Now that, of course, is nothing short of complete madness. Don't do it to the nth. Well, this is precisely what happened in Greece. The credit card was the bailout, and the austerity conditions were the conditions that ensured that the falling income due to the recession would crash as a result of the harshest austerity in the history of capitalism. And of course, what happens when the credit card runs out? Well, either you have to declare your bankruptcy then, or get another credit card. In 2012, Greece was given its second bailout, 2 years after the first one. And towards the end of 2014, that second bailout was running out. During the election campaign of Syriza, promised them that we would not take out a third credit card, a third bailout.
The opinion polls say the leader of the Greek far left is on the verge of winning a snap election. Many here are way to the left of any mainstream party. Tsipras's aim is to make resistance to austerity mainstream throughout Europe.
Completely far left, they just don't like bankers. Which is a feature, I suppose. That's the main thing, really.
Ακυρώνει σήμερα με τρόπο αδιαμφισβήτητο τα μνημόνια της λιτότητας και της καταστροφής.
It was absolutely fantastically remarkable. Watching a society that had been beaten into submission. The demonstrations of 2011 had ended. People were quiet. They were staying in their homes, not demonstrating, licking their wounds, privatizing their fears and their terror. And suddenly, in January 2015, that extreme depression, that extreme case of privatizing aspirations, dreams, and nightmares, gave rise to an explosion of hope, to a popular movement that went beyond party political divisions. I had people stopping me in the street saying, I'm a right-winger, I voted for New Democracy, I never voted for you, but we're together. We need to recover our dignity. We need to escape debtor's prison. Going from 3-4% in very few years to 40% to win government, that goes to show it takes a small spark of hope to ignite a revolutionary moment, a moment in history that rewrites the set of possibilities. The beginning was splendid. I remember immediately after our being sworn in by the President of the Republic, I popped into the Prime Minister's office. It was the first time I entered that room. It was the first day in office. I walked in, I looked at Alexis, he looked at me. We sort of felt awkward being in that room. We hugged. At the same time, we looked at one another and we said, oh my God, what have we done? We are running this place now. Immediately after that, it was just the two of us in a large prime ministerial office. He says to me, well, look around, but don't get enamored of it, because these buildings were not made for us. He said, we were created to be out there on the street demonstrating against the people in these buildings. So don't get too comfortable in here. Let's always be ready to be out there. And I remember feeling very touched, very moved. I was almost in tears, and we hugged again. It was at moments like that at the beginning when I thought we were invincible. And I have no doubt that had we remained like that, we would have been invincible.
Some interesting little factoids about the meetings he has. And this one.
Larry Summers is a very smart economist, who is also a systems man, an establishment man. He rose to be the Treasury Secretary of Bill Clinton and implemented the complete unshackling of Wall Street. Interestingly, he's also the man that President Obama brought back in to the administration to fix things. When I sat down with him that late night at a particular Washington, D.C. hotel bar, he said, Yanis, there are two kinds of politicians. They're the outsiders, who are quite happy to get on a soapbox and tell the world what they believe in, but very soon they get jettisoned by the system and in the end make no difference. And there are the insiders. The golden rule of the insiders is you never turn against another insider, and you use whatever information you get internally within the establishment. What kind of politician are you? That was his question.
Cello work in the Deepnest.
In my first meeting with Michel Sapin, the French finance minister, we spent an hour like brothers in arms. He agreed with everything I put forward as ideas about the debt, about the Greek program, the ending of austerity. It was a meeting of souls, minds, ideologists. And then we step out for the traditional press conference.
We need a short space of time during which to table our proposals.
And then he starts speaking.
Qui permettent d'alléger le fardeau de la dette, parce que 175%.
On my obligation to my creditors to keep on imposing the austerity program. I thought, what? As we were walking away, he became affable again. And I turned around and said, who are you? And what have you done to my Michel? All he said was, Yanis, you must understand, France is not what it used to be.
this guitar.
Is Mr. Varoufakis someone you can do business with?
Well, he's clearly an able and intelligent representative of the Greek
slime,
government.
Osborne!
Meine Skepsis auch nicht verhehlen können in dem Gespräch, dass manche der...
As Dr. Schäuble said, we didn't reach an agreement. It was never on the cards that we would. We didn't even agree to disagree from where I'm standing. What we are suggesting to our European partners is, you may not like the fact that we were elected because we're a left-wing party, but use us in the context of a European project for turning a page in Greece and turning a page in Europe.
I don't know if and when they run out of cash, because I don't control the till in Athens. That is their responsibility. All that I know is that we can only release further loans from the European funds if there is a full agreement on the total package and if they start implementing reforms.
Good evening. The new Greek government's not even a week old, but today the first major standoff. The country's finance minister said he'll no longer cooperate with the Troika. Greece has just 4 weeks to find a way to make its repayments, or the country will quite simply run out of money.
In my first Eurogroup meeting, I tried, in my rookie speech, to signal a readiness to compromise. To say to them that, look, folks, here there is a clash between two different principles. There's the principle of continuity. Yes, we are a new government, but that does not mean that we do not have commitments to you.
It is of the utmost importance that Greece remains on a path of recovery.
And I'm here, dedicated to working with you, sitting around the table, for as long as it takes to find an honorable compromise, one that allows us to breathe and at the same time helps repay most of the loans to our creditors.
This requires commitment to the reform process and to fiscal sustainability. Taking unilateral steps or ignoring previous arrangements is not the way forward.
But at the same time, there's the principle of democracy. We have a new mandate to contest those agreements. I thought this was the apotheosis of moderation.
Hope there's a bench around here somewhere.
I could see Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister, getting very agitated. He gets the floor and very quickly comes up with a classic line. Elections cannot be allowed to change economic policy. To which, of course, I retorted that this is excellent news for the Chinese Communist Party, because they agree.
This Eurogroup was never meant to settle any issues. I was invited because I'm the new kid on the block, so to speak.
They're gonna kill us. Suspicious.
The idea of Troika visits comprising cabals of technocrats from the three institutions in lockstep, walking into our ministries and trying to implement a program which has failed, at least in the estimation of our government and I think of our people. That is a thing of the past.
It is true that we have already wasted the last of our liquidity and we're in a very difficult situation.
How long do you have left?
It depends.
You famously sort of recorded some of your Eurogroup meetings because the briefings were kind of, you wanted to make sure that the briefings were accurate to what you had heard in the meeting.
What's so strange about that? I had to report to Parliament. So we want to end this. We want to end. This is not going to be a government that's going to fool you into believing that we are interested in a reform program just because we want the next loan tranche. You may have gathered that we don't give a damn about the next loan tranche. We prefer to go down in flames than to keep extending this indignity.
What, you were secretly recording conversations?
Absolutely.
How dare he?
You know, it didn't happen by design. I go into the first meeting of ministers of finance. Yeah, that was my inaugural Eurogroup meeting, as it's called. At the end of that meeting, which was a soul-destroying meeting, I came out dazed, confused, with a threat that the banks of our nation would be closed within 5 days. These are seriously stressful moments. I called my secretary and said, Fotini, get me a transcript of the 10.5 hours. And I would have to inform the cabinet, the prime minister, and I have to confess that after 10.5 hours, of course, I remember what had happened, but not verbatim. You know, when you are under so much psychological and physical stress, there are things you forgot who exactly said what and the order in which it was said. So I asked for a transcript and minutes of the meeting. And she called me 10 minutes later saying, Minister, I was told that there are no minutes, no records at all. And then it's wall-to-wall coverage globally, and a version of the truth that has nothing to do with the truth is registered as the truth. And I have absolutely no way of defending myself. So after a while, I started recording every meeting. I watched the transmission of fake news during my period in office. There's been a very serious misunderstanding, which I hope was not intentional by members of the press. Not everybody, thankfully.
You won't deal with the Troika, is that right? You will not deal with the institutions that are your creditors?
By the way, I was listening to your report, and I have to tell you, I'm a great BBC fan. I've never listened to such an inaccurate report. I would be in a meeting in some godforsaken neon-lit room in Brussels.
Press secretary
with
in charge
the
of it for
creditors,
fucking 10 years.
representatives, Europe ministers, and so on. Some of my interlocutors, or their minions, would send a message to one or two key journalists waiting outside, representing the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times. This was genuinely fake news, reporting that I said something which I had not said, or that something was said to me which was not said to me. Those journalists would not necessarily print it in their newspaper, but they would tweet it. But we heard that this was what Varoufakis said or what was said to Varoufakis. Very soon after that, it was printed all over the world. It was reproduced as fact. And then they would print it,
it's not right,
reporting that the world press is saying this, not reporting their own sources.
Yanis.
There is no democratic deficit in Brussels. It's like saying that there is a deficit of oxygen on the moon. There is no deficit of oxygen on the moon, there is just no oxygen. Similarly, there is no democracy in Brussels. Brussels is a cartel.
Two things can be true.
European countries fought long and hard to establish democratic regimes. And we have them. And it's a magnificent thing that we have functioning democracies, at least formally speaking. But at the same time, we created the European Union.
Anti-European Union, rather.
We brought together these nation states and pushed all the important decisions onto Brussels. It was the first version of the European Common Market of the European Union, the so-called European Communities of Coal and Steel. Exactly like
I know that, Yanis.
But the problem with a cartel is that it is inimical to democracy. OPEC could never be democratic. The only way of fixing prices is through an agreement between oligarchs. So a pan-European cartel, which is what the European Union was always meant and always designed to be a democracy-free zone. To legitimize that cartel, at some point it was important to create something called the European Parliament.
Documentary maker.
Which is, however, the only parliament in the history of the world that doesn't have the capacity to initiate legislation, which makes it a joke, really. Just a rubber stamp.
Yes. That bit again.
Point, it was important to create something called the European Parliament, which is, however, the only parliament in the history of the world that doesn't have the capacity to initiate legislation, which makes it a joke, really. Just a rubber stamp.
Got it the wrong way around. Their House of Lords makes the legislation and Parliament rubber stamps it.
And one of the things that you mentioned is that they had imposed a 4.5% primary surplus. No country's ever had that kind of a primary surplus for the length of time that was dictated. How did the Greek government, the previous Greek government, sign a program like that? And how could the ECB and the Troika propose a program like that? And one more question. Are they serious about doing that? Have they changed their mind now?
I think it's the politics of denial. The greatest embarrassment for the Troika officials that I worked with was that the proposals I was putting to them would have normally been the kinds of proposals they would be putting forward. For instance, when it came to the debt restructuring proposals, the debt swaps, I had worked on them with people like Thomas Mayer, who used to be the chief economist of Deutsche Bank, of all places.
It's the chief economist of Deutsche Bank.
What if we were to admit that an unpayable debt cannot be paid, and it has to be restructured? This is something that Wall Street lawyers do every day.
So why were they insisting on rejecting these proposals and sticking to a program which they themselves understood to be catastrophic for Greece and not particularly helpful to them? Amartya Sen put it brilliantly to me once. He said, your trouble, Yanis, was that you were negotiating with creditors who did not want their money back. The beauty of it all was that this interpretation was offered to me by one of the top officials of the Troika, Christine Lagarde, the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, who, in our first face-to-face one-on-one meeting, at some point astounded me by admitting that the program that she and the rest of the Troika were imposing upon Greece all those years, and which they still wanted to impose upon me and my government, could not work. This is verbatim. He said, Yanis, of course you're right, this program cannot work. This is not to say that it's difficult to make it work. It's an impossibility theorem.
You know, deep down, I don't know whether you have this. You probably don't. You're Noam Chomsky, you wouldn't. But I'm less experienced in this game of clashing with powers that be at that level. And deep down, I think if I psychoanalyze myself, I really wanted to think that the adults know what they're doing. And that I'm the child that is recalcitrant and kicking and screaming. But deep down, the adults, you know, the people in power at the top of the IMF know what they're doing. And my complaints and protestations, maybe they're not completely accurate. Maybe they know more than I think they do. But when these people turn around to me and say, you're right, it can't work. What we are trying to impose upon your nation can't work. But, Yanis,
stuck in here now, am I?
You must understand, we have invested so much political capital in this program. We can't go back. And your credibility, my credibility, depends on accepting it.
Of course, I didn't give a damn about my credibility with Christine Lagarde or any of these people. All I cared about was my credibility with the voters, the Greeks who were languishing in debtor's prison. Well, that's only 10% of the story. And look, the IMF is the worst of the worst. They are throwing a spanner in the works. My interpretation is they're being so recalcitrant and so obnoxious, they can't possibly want a solution, and they can't possibly want a default either. It seems to me that they want out.
You know, the Eurogroup, by the way, doesn't exist. Did you know that? I didn't know it. I found out that it doesn't exist when, in the Eurogroup, I contested the choice, a decision made by its president.
Interesting.
And I contested the legality of that decision. And he turned around and he said, oh, I can do it. And I put my hand up again and said, excuse me, I would like a legal opinion from the Secretariat as to whether this is true. I'm a Minister of Finance, I belong to the Eurogroup, I have the right to ask for legal advice from the Eurogroup Secretariat. There was a kerfuffle for about 10-15 minutes. They were sort of talking on the phone and trying to find out what to answer. And the official answer came. And the official answer was, lo and behold, Minister, the Eurogroup does not exist in law. It's not mentioned in any European Union treaty. It's an informal meeting. And therefore, its president can do anything he likes. Today's Eurogroup meeting condemned the awfully inaccurate and unhelpful supposed leaks that marred the aftermath of the previous Eurogroup meeting in Riga.
Thank you. Now I'd like to turn to Yanis.
Let me start also with a comment on leaks. It would be good if there were none, but if there are leaks, it would be good if they were accurate. I remember years and years before entering politics, how grateful I was to people like Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. As a young man, I was terrified by 1984, George Orwell's book. I felt, my goodness, you know, this is a very pressing, very prophetic book, because technology is going to make it absolutely possible, inevitable, that Big Brother will have a way of knowing where I am at every point in time, what I'm saying, who am I speaking with, and so on.
All understand it really well.
And that is a terrifying thought. I mean, now this is our reality, as we all know. And I could not imagine what would stop tyranny from developing on the basis of Big Brother. What could stop Big Brother? And the whole notion of WikiLeaks gave me hope, long before it became well known internationally. And what is that notion? That we take the technologies of Big Brother and we convert them into a gigantic mirror that we turn towards the face of Big Brother. So that Big Brother knows that as he's watching us, we are watching him. That idea liberated me from the fear of technology and the fear of Big Brother. Once he called me and he said, I've got something very interesting for you to hear. And I went to the embassy and he played a tape of a discussion that was leaked to WikiLeaks from unknown sources between apparatchiks of the International Monetary Fund, where they were confirming everything I was saying about the Greek program and the Greek austerity, with actually a degree of passion and a degree of indignity that the IMF, Germany, the German government of Germany, the German government, the European Central Bank were doing this to the poor Greek people. We have to break down these barriers and we have to turn the mirror towards the face of Big Brother.
But what tangibly can you do going forward?
Okay. I would like us to demand collectively, as Europeans, as European citizens, that we shall all agree that every time Cameron, Tsipras, Merkel meet, that their meetings should be
fucking cameras
live streamed. And we should be able to listen to what they say. How about that? How about demanding that the European Central Bank governing board meetings record minutes which are then published on the internet?
It's like a clapometer.
We don't need new institutions or treaties for this. We can agree
nervous
for
there,
next
are
week.
you? Go back to presenting Dragon's Den,
body politic
you cunt.
Is a powerful body politic which disempowers those politicians who are running agendas against the interest of the majority.
Mr. Varoufakis, you've been in virtual deadlock for months now. Isn't the truth that you're going to have to row back on some of the promises you made to get elected in order to reach agreements with Greece's creditors?
We have compromised to a very large extent. Is there going to be a redistribution of the burdens of the crisis from the shoulders of the weak, who can't bear them anymore,
onto the shoulders of those who were partly responsible for causing the crisis and who are not burdened by those burdens at all at the moment. I should make an announcement, give a press conference as I always do after Eurogroup, and then the Prime Minister should come out and declare that the next day there will be no payment to the IMF and call our partners and institutions to urgent discussions on how to resolve the situation. That was my recommendation. Before the conversation could come to a conclusion, the phone rings and it's the Bank of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis, who absolutely, by accident and miraculously, happened to find 650 million for us. Yeah? Isn't it astonishing? What a stroke of luck at the very last moment.
He's done it.
I mean, they think we're complete idiots, don't they? So, look, this money that never existed, they created it. Alexis is very smart. You know, he said,
bloody
bastards.
Amazing game, this.
Now they're making it impossible that we should default on them. So,
one more of
we're
the
being
triumph
dragged further and
defeat.
further into a labyrinth. Oh. This is what's going on.
Yes, he is. Everyone's favorite sour.
It is quite clear that the reason why we've had a deposit flight was because every day, even before we were elected, Greeks were being told that if we are elected and if we stay in power for more than a few days, the ATMs will cease function. Well, right on cue. But this is Brussels, right? So I've been asked whether the people manning and womaning those institutions, the apparatchiks, the bureaucrats, whether they're awful people, evil people. The answer is very clear. No, they're not. They're not even that. Because, let's face it, truly evil people are interesting. Homo bureaucraticus is a banal creature. Homo bureaucraticus comes to you with a list and boxes that they need to be ticked. And the whole conversation, which has a semblance of a conversation, is not really a conversation. It is an algorithm, the purpose of which is to extract all those demands, all those concessions from you. So in the end, the people that you're dealing with are like robots, they're like automata. They're neither good nor bad. And they had effectively to be bleached of human content in order to be performing their duties. There is a Darwinian process of selection within those institutions that select for banality. And even if one is not banal, one has to become banal in order to rise to the position of power like that is necessary for them to be facing someone like a Minister of Finance. And as a politician who has been elected to serve the public, facing them, it is of the essence that you bypass them, that you go beyond the banal and you meet genuinely interesting people who are at the top of those institutions, like people like Christine Lagarde, like Wolfgang Schäuble, who were nastier in many important ways, or nicer, but at least they were human beings. It's my considered opinion that now the agreement has to be reached at the level of political leaders, heads of state, prime ministers, chancellors. Greeks need a missing ingredient: hope. A speech of hope for Greece is precisely that which would take and make all the difference now. A speech of hope for Greece would benefit our creditors, as our renaissance will eliminate the probability of defaulting on their loans. Who should deliver the speech of hope? Well, I think it should be the German Chancellor. So Tsipras was obviously banking on Merkel to be the good cop. Usually she's the one that is full of understanding. This time she said, by the way, you need to have a surplus, primary surplus of 2.5% next year. No less than that. It's ridiculous.
Δεν
do you get out of here?
You may have noticed that in my presentation, I tried to be positive, to talk about a possible agreement, an agreement that we're tabling, which we believe, deeply believe, that if it was accepted, or it became the foundation upon which an agreement is based, a final agreement, a compromise, we would make this crisis go away. In this frame of mind, I'm going to refuse to discuss speculation about failure.
Could really have done with keeping my compass on.
There are moments when your interlocutor surprises you. And that moment in my relationship with the German finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, came when he broke with the tradition of the previous months when he was effectively instructing me to do as I'm told. It came when I asked him a simple question. So let's say, Wolfgang, that I sign on the dotted line here. Do you think this would be the end of the crisis? Because my fear is that if I sign on the dotted line, this crunch that we just experienced and which we're experiencing now is simply going to repeat itself in 6 months' time, only it will be worse. And he agreed. And I thought, oh my God, he's agreeing. if he is agreeing, what am I going to say? And then he added, but you realize that I cannot be seen to be acquiescent with you. And what he meant, it was clear. And there was a logic to it as well. That if it was revealed that the two of us had struck an agreement that was mutually beneficial, that would be a signal to the good people of Spain that if they voted for a government like ours, they could get a good deal for Spain, to the good people of Ireland, to the good people of Italy, finally, to the good people of France. And Wolfgang was clear on this. He wanted the Troika in Paris. And we Greeks were collateral damage.
What is really going on? There is a titanic battle between, on the one hand, the IMF and Berlin.
I mean, there is that.
And at the same time, there is Paris versus Berlin. So Greece is a little mouse that is being squashed while the elephants are tussling, trying to work out their differences.
I said to him, Wolfgang, I want to ask you a favor. Can you please stop telling me what to do? And just for 10 minutes, have a conversation with me as a friend. And the question is this. If you were in my shoes, would you sign that document? He didn't answer. For a good while, it felt like centuries to me. It was probably a couple of minutes. 2 minutes can be a very, very long time under the circumstances. And he turned back to me and he said, no, I wouldn't. And I said, okay. So what do we do? And he just raised his shoulders in a state of despondency, of genuine fatigue. A few days later, in a Eurogroup meeting, during a break, he actually congratulated me for not signing. He said to me, these are the words he used. If you signed, you would be answerable to your people.
Today, the Greek government has huge challenges. I would never change my job with him. I'm quite happy.
To make the transition from academic to politician, there had to be a major crisis. I'm only an accidental politician. I only threw my hat in the proverbial ring because of the intensity of the crisis. And the opportunity to put my money where my mouth was. Once you make the transition from academia to politics, suddenly there's no possibility of genuine dialogue. I was expecting that when finance ministers get together, we discuss finance, we discuss economics. Never did we have a discussion on those matters, not once. And when, because I was representing a country whose political economy was dying, When I brought these issues to the table, I was looked at as an outsider that impolitely barged in, demanding to have a conversation that was beyond the pale. We would have a meeting that would last 10 hours. And we would spend one and a half hours with little speeches, monologues. And then the rest of the time, 8 hours, 9 hours, was spent negotiating what? The communique. Arguing and nitpicking regarding particular words that would go in the press release. That contrast between academic life, where you live or die on the basis of the quality of your opinions, to the Eurogroup, where ideas really don't get discussed. Even policies do not get discussed. I have to say, I had not expected that.
Unfortunately, agreement has not been reached as yet.
But there will come a point where Greece will either have to compromise or it will have to default. And that is when you'll compromise, isn't it?
We have compromised enormously.
But you have to go.
But we're not going to sign on an agreement that makes this crisis worse. We are going to compromise without being compromised. That is what we're doing.
What was your strategy? What was your long-term plan?
My strategy was to bombard them with moderate proposals regarding the debt, proposals that were moderate, technocratically advanced, but at the very same time that did the job of getting us out of debtor's prison. To back this strategy, there were a couple of tactics involved. One was a deterrence plan. I knew that the way they would try to defeat us, to asphyxiate us, would be through closing down the banks. So I had a plan for deterring the closure of the banks. This involved primarily two things. Number one was the threat that if you close down my banks, I'm going to haircut the bonds that are owed by the Central Bank of Europe. And if I do that, I know you're going to have huge problems maintaining Italy within the euro because of a legal dispute with the Bundesbank, the Central Bank of Germany. And the second part of it was to create a parallel payment system that I would be able to activate outside the banking sector, outside the financial circuits, that would allow Greeks to transact with one another using the website of the Greek tax office.
Why not threaten to take Greece out of the euro?
The moment you start talking about leaving the euro in public, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because the euro is a very fragile thing, even though it looks hard and hard-nosed. All it takes for the euro to collapse is for a critical mass of people to think that it's going to collapse. If a sufficient number of people start thinking that Greece is out of the euro, Greece is out of the euro before you even know it. So for me, getting out of the euro was not the plan. It was not the objective. For others, it should have been. It wasn't for me. For me, it was a debtor structure within the euro. Of course, I was prepared to contemplate getting out of the euro, if needs be. But if this is not your aim, you should not speak the languages of Grexit.
Toying with Grexit, which is something we don't do, we are refusing to discuss it, because as I've said before, even worrying about it is like worrying about being hit by a comet in a universe in which comets are attracted to you if you're worried about them. Actually, it was put to me by somebody very high up in the IMF that
The only alternative to this slow Chinese torture kind of process is to do what the Poles did, what the Balcerowicz did in the 1990s, which is to say, we're not playing ball here, we're not going to go through this process, but instead here is a document which is our national plan for revival, recovery, growth, whatever. And ever since, I've been working on a document like that. Now I have one. And I've been trying to convince the rest of the cabinet that we should adopt this strategy. I was in a minority. But even though we gave a great deal, concessions were just, for me, they were too many and too deep. Even then, you know, they wouldn't even release some liquidity. My Troika interlocutors, from possibly the first week, they surmised I'm not somebody they can do business with, and they had to get rid of me. It was the only way of maintaining the fraudulent bankruptcy concealment process. So I had to go. It was clear from the beginning, and they tried a variety of ways until they succeeded. From the beginning, I was telling my comrades, my colleagues, the War Cabinet, the Prime Minister, that this is going to be a multi-month war of attrition. The creditors will asphyxiate us and keep on asphyxiating us until we reach the deadline. There had to be certain repayments by the Greek state to the International Monetary Fund and to the European Central Bank, money we didn't have. So either we agreed to borrow it from them in order to pretend that we're repaying them, or there had to be a debt restructure, which is what the purpose of our election was. And only at the very last moment, when they realized that we are not going to back down, would they come to us with an honorable agreement. That was of the essence. A capacity to withstand the pressure, however great it was, up until the very last moment, because the very last moment would be the only moment of truth. Everything before that would be a labyrinth of deception. The Troika were adamant that Tsipras should not be able to present himself as a prime minister who managed to get a deal with them. They wanted him to present it as somebody that was completely and utterly ritually humiliated. So every time he said yes to their demands, they asked for something more. The pressure upon me to resign had reached its heights. I didn't resign because I knew they would not allow him to surrender without dragging him through the mud, without closing down the banks, without imposing a tremendous cost upon the people of Greece for having resisted. And as long as I maintained in my heart of hearts the slightest subjective probability of belief that when he's in the mud, he would turn around and say, Yanis, okay, you were right, let's do it. Let's now confront them. Let's now resist them. Let's now say no to them. I stayed, and I didn't resign. On the 21st of June, 2015, he made his last-ditch attempt to surrender. Again, they wouldn't accept his white flag. At that point, he himself recognized that he is in an impasse. So he called the referendum, saying to the people of Greece, well, this is the ultimatum that the Troika is giving us. Yes or no?
This way, but I already know this part. I thought I was missing out.
I'm very negatively surprised by today's decisions by the Greek government. They have apparently rejected the last proposals on the table from the three institutions, and on that negative basis have proposed to Parliament to have a referendum with, again, a negative advice to the Greek people. We will hear from the Greek minister today in our meeting and then talk about future consequences.
The purpose of what we are doing all together is to actually restore the stability of the economy in Greece.
The Greek people on 5th July will be asked to agree or not to agree with the institution's proposal. That leaves open the possibility of negotiations through the night and the day, and the night and the day ahead of us, that would improve the institution's proposal.
In my view, the tragedy was that he called a referendum with the intention of losing it, whereas I fought that referendum because I wanted us to win it. Both of us share the belief that we're going to lose it.
A bit like a
because
certain
the
Mr.
moment
Johnson,
the referendum was called,
way back when
the ATMs ran out of cash.
they didn't call
The
it.
ECB closed down our banks in a bid through what I referred to at the time as the finance minister of Greece, poignantly and willfully, as a kind of financial terrorism. Because there's nothing more terroristic than closing down the ATMs of a people before they go on a vote in order to extract from them the vote you want as the creditor of that nation.
Now, what is terrorism? It's the pursuit of political agendas by means of inspiring fear in people, mind-numbing fear. Well, the choice that we were given, accept a non-viable agreement or we'll shut your banks, can be classified as such.
It was a pure case of financial terrorism. There was no economic reason to close down the banks, except effectively to blackmail the people of Greece to vote in favor of the Troika deal, in favor of the Troika ultimatum. With the media and the television screens blasting out at people in their living rooms propaganda that if they vote no to the ultimatum of the Troika, Armageddon will hit, and demonizing me and the government and anyone who opposed the Troika. We thought that this combination, in the end, would push the percentage of voters who supported us below 50%. I thought this was inevitable. So did Tsipras. The difference was that he wanted this to happen, and I was struggling against this happening.
Let me tell you something, which is probably unknown. Ever since we declared the referendum and we incensed our European partners, we had the most interesting proposals coming from Brussels. There won't be a yes verdict. I'm quite confident that the Greek people have had enough of extending and pretending.
Okay.
Like the rest of the world, by the way.
Just to nail you down a little bit more.
Please do.
So, if there's a yes vote, come Monday night, you will not be finance minister.
I will not.
A banner demanding a no vote appeared from the window of the country's finance ministry. Greece's colourful, frequently controversial finance minister has been warned by many leading figures in Europe that a no vote is a vote to leave the euro. He resolutely rejects that.
What you're actually doing here is taking your country out of the euro, but you can't tell people because you know they wouldn't vote for it.
No, no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Our membership of the euro is not at stake. Whether there is a yes or a no, there will be an agreement on Monday.
The head of the Eurogroup says that's fantasy or nowhere near an agreement. Who's right?
He would say that, wouldn't he? He really desperately wants a yes vote so as to be able to go back to his constituency and to say that they managed to humiliate our government. This is just petty politics. It's really not good for Europe.
It's obvious that we will see in the next day various forms of orchestrated attempts towards of economic aggression. It cannot be described in any other way. But I don't think that this will induce fear in the population. I think that it will induce protests.
It's our time to say no because they want the whole our land. They want our freedom, they want our rights, they want our properties, they want our homeland. I think the Greek people will fight back.
Getting somewhere now.
We're not populists, we're trying to do the right thing by the people.
More a six-day scramble than a campaign, but the passion being felt on both sides is without question. 25,000, maybe more, in Athens Central Square for the final no rally.
My hope was that a good referendum result, a courageous cry by the Greek people, would make it impossible for Alexis Tsipras, my comrade and Prime Minister, to betray them, to go back on them, to say no to them.
Hell. Circles at me.
I wanted to give the Greek people the opportunity to write history. In the end, 62% courageously, magnificently voted against the Troika.
realised I was trapped in there. Oh, you're joking.
It seems you can push people too far. A 5-year-long depression, the impoverishment of a nation, and finally the Greeks have said, "Ochi," no, enough. All the talk of the economic damage that would be caused, the Armageddon that was sure to follow, did not deter them. For 5 years they've swallowed economic medicine that has made their condition worse. They're not going to take any more of it.
Not that he says it is, but it isn't at all about Greece. He likes this
that night.
Mozart tune, doesn't he?
I allowed myself to enter the prime ministerial residence at around midnight, once the result was out. Convinced, it was, mind over matter, if you want, that it can't be. Alexis must now honor that 62%. I walked into Maximus' residence, the prime ministerial residence, together with Anai, my wife. It was like entering a freezer. Suddenly, I felt like a foreign body. I could tell that these were people in mourning, not in celebration. And I remember when the final result was flashed on the television screen in the main living area of the residence, that I jumped up and punched the air, and then turned around and realized I was the only one doing it in the room. Finally, when I entered his office, I could see that he was distraught, that he was mourning our victory. It was a given that the conversation would not end well. On that night, my simple message to him was, the people out there wrote history. Are we going to honor it? And he started giving me all sorts of excuses. He even mentioned a word that in Greek history resonates awfully. The name is Goudi. Goudi is a suburb of Athens where there was an execution of government ministers after 1922, effectively an allusion to being executed. I turned around and said, fantastic. Let them make our day. Imagine if we get executed for doing the right thing. We'll become legends, Alex. He offered me all sorts of different positions in the government. I turned them all down. And he said to me, it's time to surrender. I disagreed, and I resigned. Ο Αλέξης φοβάται, είναι φοβισμένος. Δεν είναι έτοιμος να πετάξει στον δρόμο το δραγασάκι του Σαγιά και να κρατήσει εμένα. Οπότε θα πάει όσο μπορεί συμβιβαστικά με ευκλήδη με τους υπόλοιπους και η αποτυχία θα είναι πλήρης. Είναι πλήρης. Αυτό το 61,5% είναι καταπληκτικό πράγμα. Θα πρέπει κάπως να μην το προδώσουμε. Αλλά εγώ δεν θα το... για μένα θα το πρόδιδα αν παρέμεινα δίθεν υπουργός οικονομικών. Ο κόσμος νομίζει ότι είμαι ένας πανίσχυρος υπουργός οικονομικών που πάω με το Σόιμπλε, κοιταζόμαστε στα μάτια και έχω εγώ το Υπουργείο από πίσω μου και εκείνος το δικό του Υπουργείο από πίσω. Εγώ δεν το έχω. Εγώ έχω την Φωτεινή και τον Σόκο και τον Καφούρα. Δεν έχω Υπουργείο από πίσω μου, δεν έχω κυβέρνηση από πίσω. Ο Σόιμπλε έχει όλη την πανοπλία του Υπουργείου Οικονομικών της Γερμανίας. Που είναι βεβαίως και Υπουργείο Οικονομικών της Γερμανίας. Έτσι. Αλλά πέραν αυτού, εγώ δεν έχω ούτε καν την υποστήριξη αυτού του αδύναμου Υπουργείου Οικονομικών της Ελλάδας. Να μείνω εγώ τώρα στο Υπουργείο Οικονομικών γιατί. Συν το ότι έχω υποστεί τόσες μεγάλες δολιοφθορές και εξευτελισμούς τις τελευταίες εβδομάδες, μήνες, που έχω κουραστεί. Και νομίζω ότι είναι καλύτερο για όλους να ανανύψω, να πάρω ανάσες, γιατί αυτός ο αγώνας μόλις τώρα ξεκινάει. Μόλις τώρα ξεκινάει.
A shock announcement after a triumphant victory. Greek Finance Minister Yanis Varoufakis is stepping down. He's expected to remain in the Syriza party and is extremely popular at home. But as Tsipras's government and Eurozone leaders meet this week, both sides will be hoping a fresh face on the negotiating table will bring new impetus to bailout talks.
Yanis Varoufakis resigned earlier this morning. Does that make it any more likely that Greece is going to be able to reach a deal with its European creditors?
Yes, I believe European leaders and Eurogroup officials are relieved that Mr. Varoufakis will no longer be representing Greece at the meetings.
Varoufakis' origins in the centre of politics convinced some in Syriza that he was, as they put it, a neoliberal. But they soon found out otherwise. In the negotiations, Varoufakis was the toughest in favour of a strong deal for Greece and the most prepared of all the ministers to, if necessary, default on Greece's debts and exit the Eurozone.
I never imagined what happened was going to happen.
Any regrets as you look back on what happened during that period as to how it was handled with creditors?
Well, plenty, a myriad of regrets. We failed.
Do you think you messed up at all?
There were mistakes, of course. It takes incredible obstinacy to argue that one has not made mistakes, especially during a 5-month period of extremely intense negotiations against creditors who were not particularly interested in having a rational bargaining session, a rational negotiation. We made mistakes, there's no doubt about that, and I hold myself responsible for a number of them.
If you could do it all again, what would you change?
That's the first mistake, Yanis, admitting that you made a fucking mistake and that there's a problem. Can't be doing that.
Given what I knew.
Everything's fine and it's everyone
When we were
else's fault.
elected, the clash with the creditors would have happened by default within 4 weeks, which is a very short space of time. Once you're elected, you have 4 weeks before Armageddon hits. Now, my policy was to extend that period until June, at least, or July, to give ourselves another 4 months, during which to try to establish the ground for an honorable compromise with the creditors. These 4 months, instead of being 4 months during which the Prime Minister and myself and the rest of the world cabinet were getting more united, more prepared, and bonded together in such a way as to maximize our chances of overcoming. Those 4 months were used by Mrs. Merkel to prize Tsipras away from me, to co-opt him, and to prepare him for the very humiliating process of gradual capitulation which led to the surrender of that following summer.
We had weapons that we could use. We didn't use them. There was a part of our debt, 27 billion, which is not a very large part of the debt, but it was a significant part of the debt, that was parked on the books of the European Central Bank. But that 27 billion was Greek government debt written in Greek law, which means that I had the capacity, as the Minister of Finance, to restructure it, to postpone by 20 years its repayment, and then the ECB would have to contest my decision in a Greek court. And I would have won, I can assure you.
Which we should remind people that Greek courts don't act very fast.
Yes, and that's the one occasion where this delay with inefficiency would be a godsend.
They don't, but you know, unnecessary.
So, and the reason why this was an important weapon was because the only
Welcome
reason
to
why
Dragon's
the euro
Den.
still exists
I'm a
today
cunt.
is because Mario Draghi, the president of the European Central Bank, has saved the euro. And he saved it through a kind of quantitative easing like you had here in Britain, you still have. The problem that
Might
Draghi
not be
faced
him, but it might as well
was
be.
that the Central Bank of Germany, which belongs to is part and parcel of the European Central Bank, was constantly in his case, constantly trying to undermine him. They even took Draghi and the European Central Bank to the Constitutional Court of Germany in Karlsruhe, effectively asking the German judges, the German Central Bank is asking the German judges to rule that the Central Bank, through quantitative easing, was effectively violating the German constitution. And if the German judges agreed, effectively that would stop QE in Europe and that would end the Eurozone. Why am I telling you this? Because the Central Bank's defense in the Constitutional Court of Germany was, yes, we are buying debt against our charter, but don't worry about it because it will never be written down and it will never be restructured. So if we restructure that small amount, relatively small amount, that effectively would be adding fuel to the case of the Bundesbank and the whole of the Eurozone would be in jeopardy. That was a major weapon we had. Yeah. And we had an agreement with the Prime Minister and with the inner cabinet, what I call the war cabinet, that we would use it the moment the war of attrition reached the stage where they would shut down our banking sector. But when they did shut down our banks, and I reminded my colleagues, my comrades, that we had agreed we would unleash that little weapon that we had, they vetoed it and they said no.
After the surrender, what happened? A litany of small surrenders and abuses of logic against an already suffering population. In other words, in a country that was suffering a humanitarian hunger crisis, VAT on food was increasing, signed and sealed by a government of the radical left. The social democratic governments of the 1990s, they had introduced a small top-up payment for the minimum pension. So pensioners receiving something like 200 euros, well below the poverty level, were given a top-up of another 100 euros. A government of the radical left signed a law that did away with it. The saving was minuscule for the budget of the government. But the creditors were insistent on having the radical left government remove that 100 euro payment from the poorest of the poor and elderly people. Pensions had already been cut 12 times by 42% before 2015. So what did they do after they surrendered? A further 20% reduction. But the plot gets worse and thickens further. The whole property bundle of the Greek state, which includes archaeological sites, national treasures, beaches, ports, airports, railways, every single public asset, it's including water, including electricity, mountains, even the Lycabettus Hill in Athens, where I take my dog for a walk every morning. Every asset was bundled together and inserted into something that they called the super fund. The super fund has one objective: a fire sale, to sell everything, to sell as much of it as possible and take the money and give it to the creditors. I do not believe that in the history of humanity you ended up with this kind of transfer of property rights from one nation to another entity without having first been defeated at war. It is part of human nature that when you've committed a crime, when you've damaged other people, it is quite natural, I understand that you would like to think that everybody is like you. And the moment you manage to convert someone who is against those acts to actually carry them out, you feel better. So, from the Troika's perspective, having a government being elected in Greece of the radical left, which they managed to turn, take somebody like Tsipras, who made his career by saying, no, Mrs. Merkel, you're going to have to leave our land and you're going to have to allow us to restore our dignity.
Το μήνυμα που θα λέει, go back κυρία Μέρκελ, go back κύριε Σόιμπλε.
To have him, in the end, implement every single one of the policies that he was elected to oppose, and also doing a mea culpa and being the greatest apologist for that failed program. That is a wet dream for every torturer, for every oppressor, for every tyrant. The Syriza government, once it broke with our contract with our voters, was bathed in glory by the media. The lure of that kind of credibility is the worst enemy of progressive politics.
You were at the height of Greek power.
Oh, no power. Maybe I was in the center of the frame, but I was the finance minister of a bankrupt country. That doesn't make you particularly powerful, Amy, but it makes you it makes you a target, especially the target of the establishment.
So what awaited you in the coming years?
Nothing angers and concentrates the mind of the oligarchy more than that feeling, which is completely unfamiliar to them, of not remaining in control. The 62% of the Greeks who voted against them, that no, had to be discredited. Those people had to be made not only to regret their choices, but also to denounce it, and to denounce anyone that was associated with it. By a historical accident, I was chosen to be the person that the oligarchy targeted. I had to be brought down symbolically in order to represent the complete collapse of what they call themselves the Greek Spring.
You never lectured or hectored your colleagues?
Absolutely not, but I can tell you what I did.
But a lot of
and I'm
people said you
exceptionally
did.
proud of what I did.
A lot of people said you did.
Well,
a lot of people said you were the key
bring them
obstacle.
here so that they
You
can
were the
actually
key
confront me.
obstacle
I
to-
need to confront
a
my
deal.
accusers team.
According to you, everybody's been lying
Bring
about
somebody
what,
here in
about
front of
what
me.
took place, except
Bring
you.
somebody here in front
It's
of me.
not credible, Yanis Varoufakis,
Well-
that everybody has lied about this except you.
Well,
That's stretching credibility, isn't it?
You are interviewing me. I can only tell you what I experienced.
We would desist from doing anything that was against Greece's interests. That's what you wrote. And then you signed an agreement that
I
you now
didn't.
say is right against.
Tim, I didn't. I resigned on the night.
But you said a no vote would strengthen your bargaining position.
Yes, provided we
But it
still
didn't.
wanted to bargain.
But it didn't.
Because we didn't want to bargain after that. My prime minister decided to surrender on the night of the referendum.
There were daily fake news stories that were so abundantly untrue that they confirmed brilliantly Joseph Goebbels' dictum that if you want awful propaganda, if you want a gigantic lie to stick, you have to make sure that the lie is out of proportion, that it is humongous in size, and that you repeat it constantly. This is exactly what they did. But of course, this is nothing personal. This is what an oligarchy does when an oligarchy gets threatened.
Thank you for your talk, Mr. Varoufakis, and I have to say, content-wise, I sympathize with you very much.
Bloody explosions!
But I read the reconstruction of The Guardian last week, which I'm sure you've read as well. I'd like to confront you with a few quotes,
Oh,
two
is
very
it the
brief
Oxford
ones.
Union?
The first one is, Varoufakis had done nothing but exasperate his fellow finance ministers.
It's true.
And second of all, content-wise, you may or may not be right, but everyone just seems to hate you. And
No, that's not true. Don't overdo it. Look.
Excuse me, sir. Isn't the reason that you lost the battle, the battle that was so important, isn't it not because it was totally impossible, but also because of the way you personally interacted with everyone, made only enemies, and that was the reason that in the end they just weren't able and willing to listen to you? Wasn't that one of the huge problems?
Well, the answer to this question is very simple. No. I had very good relationships. I had a very good relationship personally with all of them, especially with Wolfgang Schäuble. With Dijsselbloem, I didn't have a relationship, either positive or negative. He confirms this. My relations with my interlocutors in Brussels, in Berlin, in Paris, were at a personal level very good, mostly. Especially with the German finance minister, after their first one or two meetings, they became very cordial and very warm. With the French, perfect. With the head of the European Central Bank and the number 2, Benoît Cœuré, splendid. The problem Greece's creditors had with me was one and very simple. They could see in me someone that would rather die than sign on the dotted line of another extend and pretend bailout loan. The pressure, which was inordinate, that was being exerted upon me, was just a walk in the park compared to what my dad went through. My dad ended up in a concentration camp because he was refusing to put his signature where he was being told to put it. So when I was in Brussels and in Frankfurt and in Berlin, and I was being confronted by this immense pressure, I caught myself on a couple of occasions thinking, if only they knew.
Yes.
So what kept you? Because it was hard.
That's a shitload.
Yes.
Of
If you signed, you get out.
I would be free. But I never did it. I believed in my own spirits.
Do you regret not signing?
No. Never. Never. I resisted. Never. Yeah.
They would have these big sacks that were originally used to carry potatoes. Yeah. And they would put him in there together with a cat, tied up, and throw it in the sea. So the cat would be drowning and tear up his face. And then we put him on and said, will you sign? No, do it here. With a cat. Some occasion with snakes. They had to endure serial killings. So they would line them up on top of the cliff next to the sea, overlooking the waves. And they would line 10 of them up. And they would go to the first one and say, okay, will you sign? Say no. Off. Shot in the head. Some would break and sign. The rest are. So that was one of the favorite tortures, which is not torture, just murder. Do you have a message for the young people of today?
Yes, they must try always. You must try hard.
Good advice.
After the referendum, how did the public respond to the betrayal?
Most people fail to recognize what a motivating force dignity can be, and a project for restoring it. Unemployment, not being able to fend for oneself, to put food on the table, to look after their children, these are all scourges. But the worst effect that they have on the human soul is that they deny one a sense of dignity, a sense of autonomy, a sense of pride. The beauty of that Syntagma Square gathering on the 3rd of July in 2015 was disenfranchised, powerless people got together, and by the act of getting together, they managed to feel dignity flooding back into their souls. So when 3 days later, the Prime Minister overthrew the people's will and took that energy, that dignity restoration project, and shoved it in the dustbin of history by converting their courageous no into an undignified yes, that the very same people who were elated on that night were distraught. I could see people on street corners bumping into each other, and without speaking, they would hug and cry as a result of the indignity of the moment of surrender. This contrast is going to stay with me forever. And if I'm motivated by anything, it is by the disappointment and rage at the dying of that particular light and an urgency for restoring it.